Nora, your sister is going to be a mother now. She needs the space. You are a single woman with a sick old dog. Moving out for a few months will not kill you. That was Vivian. She stood in the centre of the antebellum kitchen I had just spent $50,000 restoring, demanding I hand over my keys to the man who was currently sleeping with my sister in my bed. Buster. My golden retriever trembled against my leg. If you've ever had your kindness mistaken for weakness by your own blood, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I remained perfectly silent. I did not scream. I did not throw the expensive porcelain vases I had carefully curated for the entryway. I simply pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The brushed metal felt incredibly cold against my palm, grounding me in the surreal nightmare unfolding in my own home. I opened the camera application and pressed record. The red dot blinked, capturing Vivian's demanding posture, Arthur's averted gaze, and the pathetic, dishevelled figures of Julian and Jasmine standing near the staircase. Julian could not even look at me. He was staring at the floorboards I had sanded with my own hands. Jasmine was clutching a silk robe tightly around her waist. It was my silk robe. My voice came out sounding like it belonged to a stranger. It was not shaking. It was metallic, even, and devoid of any warmth. I told them they had exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever dignity they had left and get out of my sight. Jasmine immediately started to wail. She pressed a hand to her flat stomach, playing the victim, crying about her delicate condition and the stress I was causing her. Vivian stepped forward, her manicured finger pointing sharply at my chest, ready to launch into a tirade about family loyalty and forgiveness. I simply held up my phone, ensuring the camera captured her aggressive stance. I did not engage. I merely started a timer on my watch. The silence in the room became suffocating. They realised I was not going to play my usual role. I was not going to argue, plead, or negotiate. When you strip away the emotional reaction a toxic person expects, they are left with nothing but their own guilt. Jasmine scrambled up the stairs, followed closely by Julian. I walked through the living room, my boots stepping over 2 shattered crystal wine glasses. Deep crimson liquid was currently seeping into the 150-year-old oak floors. I felt a brief pang of architectural grief for the wood, but nothing for the people who stained it. I walked into my study. I ignored the expensive artwork and the designer furniture. I pulled out a single leather briefcase and packed my architectural licenses, my hard drive of blueprints, and a specific red folder I kept locked in the bottom drawer. I walked back into the hallway, clipped the leather leash onto Buster's collar, and picked him up. He was too old and arthritic to walk fast, and I was not going to let him breathe the toxic air of this house a second longer than necessary. Arthur finally spoke as I reached the front porch. He muttered something about working things out in the morning when cooler heads prevailed. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. I gave him a small, chilling smile. I stepped out into the damp, freezing night air. I did not look back at the beautifully restored porch or the glowing warm lights pouring from the windows. I placed Buster gently into the passenger seat of my car, threw the briefcase into the back, and started the engine. The heavy door clicked shut. To understand the sheer audacity of what they did, you have to understand what I built. I am 30 years old. I work as a heritage restoration architect in Charleston, South Carolina. My days are spent studying load-bearing walls, matching historic paint pigments, and saving forgotten buildings from the wrecking ball. It is meticulous, exhausting work. It requires patience and a deep respect for foundations. I thought I was building the same solid foundation in my personal life. Julian was a human resources manager when we met. He had a warm smile, a firm handshake, and a seemingly endless capacity to listen to me talk about crown moulding and floor joists. He appeared to be the steady, grounding presence I desperately craved. For 5 years, I poured my energy into our relationship. I thought we were a team. I was the ambitious one, working 80-hour weeks, negotiating with city planners, and climbing the scaffolding. He was the supportive anchor, making sure there was a hot meal waiting when I came home covered in plaster dust. We planned a beautiful life together. I found a ruined antebellum mansion in a historic, tree-lined neighbourhood. It was a structural nightmare, but I saw its bones. I purchased it and funded the entire restoration myself. Over 2 grueling years, I poured $250,000 of my own hard-earned savings into that property. Every weekend was spent tearing out dry rot, repairing sash windows, and restoring the original fireplaces. I bled for that house. It was my masterpiece, intended to be our forever home. Julian helped pick out paint colours and bought the coffee. But the financial burden and the physical labour fell entirely on my shoulders. I did not mind. I was blinded by the illusion of the perfect future I was curating. We were exactly 2 months away from our wedding. I had already paid $45,000 in cash for the venue, the caterers, and the imported floral arrangements. Julian wanted a lavish, picture-perfect day, and I wanted to give it to him. I took on extra commercial projects just to ensure we started our marriage without any debt. I would leave the house before dawn and return long after midnight, my eyes aching from staring at blueprints under harsh lights. I kept telling myself the exhaustion was temporary. I believed that once the vows were spoken and the house was fully furnished, I would finally get to rest. I thought I had secured my safe harbour. I thought Julian was the one piece of my life that was not complicated, demanding, or conditional. I constructed a beautiful, expensive reality, ignoring the fact that the man standing inside it was entirely hollow. I was so focused on fixing the structural integrity of the walls around us that I completely missed the rot spreading within the man I loved. Perfection always hides a crack. The first signs of decay did not announce themselves with a loud crash. They crept in quietly, disguised as misfortune. 4 months before the wedding, the corporate firm Julian worked for underwent a massive restructuring. He was laid off, entirely out of the blue. It was a severe blow to his ego. He had always tied his self-worth to his pristine office and his managerial title. Without it, he spiraled into a bitter, resentful depression. He stopped waking up early, he stopped making coffee. He spent his days sitting on the expensive velvet sofa I had purchased, staring blankly at the television. I tried to be as supportive as a woman working 80-hour weeks could be. I paid all the bills, managed the mortgage, and assured him we were financially secure. I encouraged him to take a breath, to use the time to figure out his next career move without pressure. That was when Jasmine started coming around. My younger sister was 27, an aspiring lifestyle influencer who had never held a real job in her life. She lived in a luxury apartment fully funded by Arthur and Vivian, spending her days taking photos of expensive lattes and trying on clothes she intended to return. Jasmine claimed she was just dropping by to keep her future brother-in-law company while I was trapped at the architecture firm. At first, it seemed harmless. I would come home dead tired, my boots caked in construction dust, and find them laughing in the kitchen over a gourmet lunch Jasmine had brought over. She always looked immaculate. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her clothes fresh and unwrinkled. Next to her, I felt like a tired workhorse. Then the subtle shifts began. The kind of shifts you only recognise when you look back through the lens of betrayal. Julian started dressing better on the days Jasmine was scheduled to visit. He started working out again, trimming his beard exactly the way Jasmine had once casually mentioned she liked. One evening, I came home early from a site inspection and found Jasmine's designer coat draped over the back of the dining chair. Julian was wearing it. I leaned in to kiss his cheek and caught the distinct heavy scent of jasmine and vanilla, my sister's signature, obscenely expensive perfume. My stomach gave a sharp, uncomfortable lurch. A primal instinct warned me that something was deeply wrong in my territory. But I pushed it down. I rationalized it immediately. They had hugged hello. She had bumped into him. I told myself I was being paranoid, exhausted by the mounting pressure of the $45,000 wedding and the endless construction delays. I chose willful blindness. I chose to trust the two people I had known my entire life over the screaming alarm bells in my own head. I was too busy paying for their comfortable lives to see they were living them together. A woman's intuition never lies. People always ask how a smart, educated woman allows herself to be used as a financial stepping stone. How did I end up paying $250,000 for a house, funding a lavish wedding, and turning a blind eye to my sister creeping into my life? The answer lies in the invisible chains of a toxic family dynamic. You do not just wake up one day and volunteer to be the family martyr. You are trained for the role from the moment you take your first breath. In our family, Jasmine was the undeniable golden child. She was delicate, highly emotional, and supposedly needed constant protection from the harsh realities of the world. Arthur and Vivian hovered over her, shielding her from every consequence and celebrating her most mediocre achievements. I, on the other hand, was the scapegoat. I was capable, quiet, and independent. Therefore, my parents decided early on that I did not require their warmth, their attention, or their resources. My achievements were expected, never celebrated. My struggles were ignored. I learned very young that the only way to earn a fraction of Arthur and Vivian's approval was to be useful. If I solved a problem, if I paid for a dinner, if I fixed something that was broken, I would get a fleeting nod of acknowledgement. It is a psychological trap known as learned helplessness. Though in my case, it was learned utility. I subconsciously believed that my inherent worth as a human being was exactly zero. My only value was the capital I could provide and the burdens I could carry for them. When I met Julian, I unconsciously recreated that exact dynamic. He played the supportive partner, but slowly, I took on all the heavy lifting. I paid for the dates, I bought the house, I funded the wedding. I thought I was securing his love through my generosity. And when Jasmine started visiting him, my parents actively encouraged it. Vivian would call me at the office, her voice dripping with fake concern, saying how wonderful it was that Jasmine was helping Julian through his depression while I was so selfishly focused on my career. They manipulated the narrative perfectly. They made me feel guilty for working hard to pay for the very roof over Julian's head. I was gaslit into believing I was a neglectful partner, which only made me work harder, pay for more things, and suppress my own suspicions. The wedding and that antebellum house were not just a celebration of love. They were my ultimate, desperate attempt to buy a seat at my own family's table. I thought if I created the perfect picture, they would finally look at me and love me the way they loved Jasmine. I was merely a transaction. There was only one person in my entire bloodline who never viewed me as a walking checkbook. My grandmother, Eleanor. Eleanor was a force of nature. She was not a warm, cookie-baking grandmother. She was a woman made of steel, sharp intellect, and tobacco smoke. She had built a massive commercial real estate portfolio from nothing, navigating a male-dominated industry in the 70s with ruthless precision. While Arthur and Vivian obsessed over social appearances and Jasmine's beauty pageants, Eleanor watched me. She was the only one who noticed when I spent hours sketching buildings instead of playing with dolls. She was the one who bought me my first professional drafting set. When I was 25, shortly before she passed away, Eleanor summoned me to her mahogany-panelled study. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and peppermint. She sat behind her massive desk, looking frail but entirely commanding. She did not offer me a cup of tea. She slid a thick, heavy red folder across the polished wood toward me. "Your parents are fools, Nora," she had said, her voice raspy but firm. "They value the paint on the walls, but they do not understand the foundation. They are raising your sister to be a parasite, and they are grooming you to be her host." I had sat there, stunned by her bluntness. Eleanor tapped the red folder with her silver pen. "I am leaving you something. It will not make sense right now. Your father thinks he is a very clever man, with his financial loopholes and his family trusts. Let him think that." She made me open the folder. Inside were complex legal documents, surveys, and a certificate bearing the words "Land and Mineral Rights." It was an irrevocable trust. Eleanor looked me dead in the eye, her gaze piercing through all my childhood insecurities. "You are an architect. You know the truth of the world better than anyone. Bricks rot, wood splinters, and paint peels. People can take the house right out from under you." She leaned forward, pressing her hand over mine. "But the dirt, Nora, the dirt is forever." I did not fully grasp the magnitude of what she had handed me that day. I tucked the red folder away, keeping it locked in the bottom drawer of my desk, right alongside my most important blueprints. When she died, Arthur and Vivian were furious that she left the bulk of her liquid assets to various charities instead of them, completely unaware of the quiet, invisible empire she had legally transferred entirely into my name. Eleanor knew a storm was coming. She knew my family would eventually try to consume me. So she handed me the ultimate weapon and introduced me to Walter, the only lawyer she ever trusted. Secrets sleep beneath the foundation. The storm hit the Carolina coast entirely unannounced, turning the highway into a blinding sheet of grey. I was supposed to be in Atlanta for a 3-day historic preservation symposium. However, a massive scheduling conflict with the keynote speakers caused the final sessions to be abruptly cancelled. Instead of staying in my hotel room and ordering overpriced room service, I rented a car and drove 4 hours through the torrential downpour. I wanted to surprise Julian. I thought it would be a romantic gesture to come home early and spend a quiet and rainy evening away from the endless wedding spreadsheets. I even stopped at our favourite Italian bakery downtown to pick up a box of expensive truffle pastries. I pulled onto our quiet, tree-lined street just past 11 o'clock. The neighbourhood was dead silent, most of the historic homes completely dark. As my headlights swept across my pristine driveway, my heart dropped into my stomach. Jasmine's obnoxiously bright yellow sports car was parked right in front of the garage doors. It was parked carelessly, one tyre crushing the manicured flower bed I had planted just a week prior. Why was she at my house at 11 at night when I was supposed to be out of state? I turned off the engine. The rain drummed a frantic, heavy beat against the roof of my car. That familiar knot in my stomach, the one I had been suppressing for weeks, tightened into a cold, undeniable dread. I grabbed the white bakery box, stepped out into the freezing rain, and walked up the front steps. I unlocked the heavy oak door as quietly as possible. The lower level of the house was dimly lit by a single amber lamp in the hallway. I took off my wet boots. My eyes immediately fell to the living room floor. 2 expensive crystal wine glasses lay shattered on the $2,000 Persian rug I had purchased to tie the room together. A dark, ugly stain of red wine was seeping deep into the pristine woven fabric, ruining it permanently. Next to the broken glass were Jasmine's designer heels, kicked off haphazardly. The absolute silence of the house was broken by a sound I will never erase from my memory. It was a rhythmic thumping coming directly from the ceiling above me. It was coming from the master bedroom. Mixed with the heavy thumping were breathless giggles and low, familiar murmurs. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around, walk back out into the freezing rain, and pretend I had never come home. I could drive away, stay at a hotel, and live a comfortable, ignorant lie. But a colder, harder part of me took over. It was the part of me that had survived a lifetime of being second best, of being the designated family workhorse. I set the bakery box down on the entryway table. My hands were perfectly steady. I walked toward the wooden staircase. Each step felt incredibly heavy, yet I made absolutely no sound. I reached the master bedroom. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open. I did not sleep a single second that night after I kicked the door open and caught them tangled in my expensive linen sheets. I retreated downstairs. I sat in the dark living room, staring blankly at the ruined Persian rug, listening to the rain beat relentlessly against the glass. Julian and Jasmine had scrambled to dress, stumbling over their pathetic excuses before fleeing into the guest room and locking the door. By the time the sun finally came up, casting a miserable, washed-out light across the ruined living room, I felt entirely hollowed out. I figured the next logical step was inevitable. I had to call Arthur and Vivian and tell them exactly what their golden child had done. I expected them to be shocked. I expected profound apologies. I expected, for the very first time in my 30 years of life, a little bit of sympathy and defence. I really should have known better. Around 9 a.m, before I even had the chance to pick up my phone, there was a sharp, aggressive knock at the front door. I dragged myself off the sofa and opened it to find Arthur and Vivian standing on the porch. They did not look concerned for my well-being. They looked fiercely defensive. I stepped aside in silence to let them in. Before I could even open my mouth to explain the horrific scene I had walked into, Vivian launched into a vicious verbal attack. She demanded to know why I was causing such a scene. Julian came down the stairs, looking like a whipped dog, with Jasmine hiding behind his shoulder. Vivian immediately rushed to Jasmine, wrapping a protective arm around her. That was when Vivian dropped the ultimate bomb. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and announced that Jasmine was pregnant with Julian's child. The wedding I was paying $45,000 in cash for was a massive, humiliating sham. I felt the hardwood floor literally tilt beneath my feet, but I forced my posture to remain perfectly straight. "Fine," I said softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "They deserve each other. I want them out of my house immediately." Arthur cleared his throat, crossing his arms over his chest. He took his usual stance of defending the indefensible. "Technically, Nora, this is not your house." I felt the blood drain from my face. He reminded me of a bureaucratic nightmare from 5 years ago. When I was finalising the mortgage, a stolen credit card incident temporarily ruined my credit score to prevent losing the property. Arthur offered a solution. He put the structure of the house under his family limited liability company to secure the better interest rate. I paid the mortgage directly from my checking account every single month. I had completely forgotten to do the legal transfer of the deed once my credit was fixed. I trusted my own parents not to steal from me. "The LLC owns the structure," Arthur continued, sounding like he was reading a corporate memo. "And as the primary trustees, your mother and I have decided to let Jasmine live here. She needs the space for the baby." Ice replaced my warm blood. They were stealing my home. The house I bled for. The floors I sanded until my hands ached. The historic walls I painstakingly colour-matched and painted. It was all being handed over on a silver platter to the sister who had just destroyed my life. Why? Because she was the golden child, and she had made a massive mistake. So she required a massive safety net, funded entirely by my sweat. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world. I did not scream. I did not throw things. The anger inside me burned so intensely hot that it instantly bypassed rage and turned into pure, crystalline ice. I realised in that exact microsecond that I could not win a screaming match. I could not win a physical fight. The paperwork for the structure was strictly on their side. If I fought them right then and there, they would drag it out, draining my energy and keeping me permanently tied to their toxic, suffocating drama. Jasmine peeked out from behind Vivian's shoulder. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on Buster. My old golden retriever was lying on his orthopedic bed near the fireplace, looking confused and anxious. Jasmine wrinkled her nose in absolute disgust. "If I am going to live here, that thing has to go," Jasmine whined, pointing a manicured finger at my dog. "It smells like wet dirt. I read that dog hair and dander are terrible for a developing fetus. If you do not take him, Nora, I am calling animal control to come drag him away. I cannot have a filthy animal around my baby." That was the defining moment. That was the precise second the final, frayed thread of familial obligation snapped in half. It was not the cheating that killed my love for them. It was not the theft of a $250,000 renovation. It was the casual, cruel threat to an innocent, arthritic animal who had offered me more loyalty in one day than my family had in 30 years. I looked at Jasmine. I looked at Julian, who was staring at the floorboards, too cowardly to defend the dog he used to pet every evening. I looked at Vivian, who was nodding in agreement with Jasmine's ridiculous demand. The illusion was completely shattered. I saw them for exactly what they were: parasites. They consumed resources, demanded absolute compliance, and destroyed anything that did not directly serve their immediate comfort. I walked over to the marble kitchen island. I unclipped my heavy ring of house keys. I dropped them onto the cold stone. The metal made a sharp, echoing clatter in the quiet room. I walked over to Buster, gently clipped his leash to his collar, and helped him up. I grabbed my leather architectural briefcase. I did not pack a single piece of designer clothing. I left the expensive furniture, the imported art, and the fully stocked refrigerator. None of it mattered anymore. I walked out the front door into the lingering drizzle. I left the illusions behind. The coastal rain had finally stopped by the time I parked my car in front of a cheap, rundown highway motel on the outskirts of Charleston. The neon vacancy sign buzzed aggressively above my head. I paid for a week in advance using a corporate credit card. The room smelled faintly of stale bleach and old cigarette smoke. The carpet was a depressing shade of brown, and the curtains barely blocked out the harsh streetlights. It was a massive downgrade from a historic antebellum mansion. It was incredibly quiet. It was safe. I set my briefcase on the wobbly laminate table. I guided Buster onto the bed, covering him with a soft blanket I kept in the trunk. He let out a long, exhausted sigh and closed his eyes. I sat down in the single plastic chair in the corner of the room. I did not cry. There were no tears left in my system, only a cold, mechanical drive to assess the damage. I opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room. I opened my personal financial spreadsheets. I am an architect. My entire life is built on assessing structural integrity and calculating loss. I stared at the numbers. $45,000 in cash, completely gone to caterers, florists, and a lakeside venue for a wedding that would never happen. $250,000 sunk into the plaster, wood, and copper piping of a house I no longer had access to. The financial bleeding was severe. But I was not bankrupt. I had spent years building my own architectural restoration firm. I was the sole proprietor. Arthur and Vivian had no access to my business accounts. Julian had no legal claim to my professional assets. They had taken my personal sanctuary, but they had not touched my ability to generate income. I began reviewing my active commercial contracts. I had 3 major municipal projects lined up for the next quarter. I needed to shift my entire focus to those blueprints. I needed to build an impenetrable fortress around my finances. I spent 4 hours meticulously changing every single password I owned. I removed Julian's name as an emergency contact on my health insurance. I completely severed every digital tie that connected me to my family. I was systematically deleting them from the administrative framework of my life. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale yellow light through the gap in the cheap motel curtains, I opened the locked compartment of my briefcase. I pulled out the heavy red folder my grandmother Eleanor had given me 5 years ago. I ran my fingers over the thick paper. I had never truly needed to look at it until now. Eleanor had known this day would come. She had seen the greed in my parents' eyes long before I was willing to accept it. I picked up my cell phone. I scrolled past 20 missed calls from Julian and a dozen demanding text messages from Vivian. I found the contact I needed. I took a deep breath. I dialed Walter's private number. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in silent compartmentalization. I did not respond to a single message from Arthur, Vivian, or Julian. I blocked Jasmine entirely across all social media platforms. I threw myself into a massive state-level restoration project, overseeing the structural reinforcement of a 19th century courthouse. I was on the scaffolding by 6 in the morning and reviewing CAD drawings until midnight. Work became my absolute sanctuary. The predictable mathematics of weight loads and stress points were incredibly soothing after the chaotic unpredictability of human betrayal. I moved out of the depressing highway motel and signed a lease on a modern, sunlit apartment right in the heart of the architectural district. It had floor-to-ceiling windows and polished concrete floors. It lacked the historic charm of my former home, but it was mine, and the security system was top tier. I took Buster to a premier veterinary specialist. I paid for advanced laser therapy and custom joint supplements. Within 2 weeks, the terrible stiffness in his hips began to fade. He started greeting me at the door with a wagging tail instead of a painful limp. He was healing, and so was I. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, I left the construction site early and walked 3 blocks to a prestigious law firm. Walter's office was on the top floor. It smelled exactly like my grandmother Eleanor's study used to old paper, expensive leather, and a hint of peppermint. Walter was a man in his late 60s, with sharp grey eyes and a demeanour that commanded absolute respect. He had managed Eleanor's complex real estate empire for 3 decades. He stood up from his massive mahogany desk as I entered, offering a warm, genuine smile. He did not ask how I was doing. He knew exactly what had transpired. In Charleston, high society gossip travels faster than a hurricane. He poured me a glass of sparkling water and sat across from me. "I am sorry about your home, Nora," Walter said, his voice quiet but firm. "Your parents are playing a very dangerous game with that LLC. They assume because they hold the deed to the structure. They hold all the power." I set my briefcase on his desk and unclasped the brass locks. "Eleanor told me once that bricks rot, but the dirt is forever. I think I finally understand what she meant. Walter, I need to know exactly what is inside this." I pulled the heavy red folder out and slid it across the polished wood toward him. Walter looked at the folder. A slow, predatory smile spreading across his weathered face. It was the smile of a man who loved a brilliant legal trap. He picked up the folder, feeling the weight of the documents inside. "Your grandmother was a visionary, Nora. She saw the greed in Arthur and Vivian long before they tried to ruin you. She knew they would use financial loopholes to manipulate you. So, she created a loophole of her own." Walter stood up and walked over to a steel cabinet in the corner of his office. He punched a code into the keypad. He opened the heavy safe. The human capacity for self-delusion is truly spectacular. While I was spending my days analysing soil densities and structural blueprints for the state, Jasmine was busy constructing a completely different kind of architecture, a fabricated digital reality. Because I had blocked her on all my personal devices, I only saw her online activity through a secondary, anonymous account I used for market research. It was an exercise in pure clinical observation. I watched her broadcast my stolen life to her 50,000 followers. Jasmine began posting daily video tours of the antebellum mansion. She would glide through the living room, her manicured hand brushing against the original oak staircase I had spent 3 weeks restoring. She would stare directly into her phone camera and boast about her refined aesthetic. She claimed she had personally selected the imported Italian marble for the kitchen counters. She spun a beautiful, elaborate lie about how she and Julian were building their dream family home from scratch. Julian, ever the opportunist, played the role of the devoted, hardworking patriarch to absolute perfection. In the background of her videos, he would be painting a nursery wall or carefully assembling a high-end designer crib. He looked incredibly proud of a life he had contributed absolutely $0 toward. The comment sections of her videos were flooded with adoring fans praising their beautiful aesthetic and their perfect, modern romance. Nobody knew the marble countertops were paid for by my 80-hour work weeks. Nobody knew the man kissing her cheek was supposed to be standing at the altar with me in less than a month. I did not leave a single angry comment. I did not attempt to expose them online or defend my honour to a crowd of strangers. A smart architect knows that when an enemy is busy building a house of cards, you do not blow it down. You simply wait for the wind, instead of reacting. I created a highly organised digital folder on my encrypted hard drive. Every time Jasmine posted a video showcasing the interior of the house, I downloaded it, I saved every timestamp, every boastful caption, and every clear shot of the architectural elements I had legally documented in my own initial restoration permits. They were so intoxicated by the illusion of their stolen wealth that they became completely reckless. In one of her live streams, Jasmine complained that the historical layout of the house was too restrictive for her modern taste. She dramatically pointed to the wall separating the parlour from the formal dining room, declaring it felt too enclosed for the open-concept nursery playroom she envisioned. She told her followers she had hired an independent contractor to knock it down over the weekend, bypassing the annoying city permits to get it done faster. I watched the live stream sitting in my quiet, secure apartment, stroking Buster's golden head. A cold, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in weeks. I knew the exact structural blueprint of that house. I knew precisely which walls held the weight of the second floor. She was about to destroy a load-bearing wall. Charleston is a city built on the preservation of history. The municipal codes governing historic districts are not merely suggestions. They are ruthless, ironclad laws designed to protect the architectural heritage from modern arrogance. Before I ever picked up a hammer, I had spent 6 months submitting detailed structural assessments, historical impact reports, and material sourcing documents to the city's Heritage Conservation Board. Every single wooden beam in that house was catalogued and legally protected. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, my professional email chimed with an automated alert. Because my architectural firm was still listed as the primary contractor of record on the initial approved master permit, the city's automated system notified me of an anonymous noise complaint filed by a neighbouring property. The complaint cited heavy demolition machinery operating without a visible municipal work permit on the front lawn. I opened the alert and read the details. Jasmine's independent, unverified contractor had indeed shown up. They had driven a heavy dumpster straight over the manicured front garden and begun smashing through the original 19th century lath and plaster. They were tearing down the wall she had complained about on her live stream, the wall that supported the primary joists of the master bedroom. I sat back in my ergonomic office chair and stared at the glowing screen. A lesser person, a sister still bound by the toxic chains of familial duty, would have picked up the phone. I could have called Arthur. I could have warned Julian that they were violating severe federal and state heritage laws. I could have saved them from the catastrophic structural damage and the impending legal nightmare. But I was no longer their scapegoat. I was no longer the invisible safety net designed to catch them every time they leaped without looking. I simply archived the automated email into my secure folder. I let them swing the sledgehammers. I let them tear into the historical fabric of the house. I knew exactly what would happen next. The Heritage Conservation Board does not send polite warning letters when an antebellum structure is illegally altered. They send municipal inspectors. They issue immediate stop work orders, and they levy fines that can bankrupt a small corporation. By removing that wall, Jasmine was not just altering a floor plan. She was severely compromising the structural integrity of the roof and simultaneously triggering a massive legal violation directly tied to the family limited liability company. Arthur and Vivian thought they were incredibly clever by putting the structure of the house in their LLC's name to control me. They had completely forgotten that ownership also means absolute liability. I closed my laptop, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and looked out the window at the city skyline. They wanted the house so desperately that they were willing to destroy my life to take it. Now, their greed was going to be the exact instrument of their own financial ruin. I did not have to lift a single finger to execute the first phase of my retaliation. The legal time bomb had officially started ticking. The audacity of a greedy person never truly peaks. It simply finds new, creative ways to expand. 2 days after the illegal demolition began, my personal cell phone rang. I looked at the caller identification. It was Vivian. I had not spoken to my mother since the morning she stood in my kitchen and demanded I hand over the keys to a man who had just betrayed me. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the silence to settle my nerves. I tapped the record button on my secondary desk phone, and then I answered. "Nora!" "Finally," Vivian said. Her voice did not hold a single ounce of warmth, apology, or maternal concern. It was brisk, sharp, and dripping with an unearned sense of authority. "What do you want, Vivian?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. I refused to call her Mom. That title required a level of care she had never provided. She paused, clearly taken aback by the use of her first name, but her inherent selfishness quickly overrode her indignation. "We have a slight cash flow issue. The contractor Jasmine hired to open up the living room demanded double his initial estimate because of some complicated wiring behind the plaster. Julian's unemployment has not cleared yet, and your father's assets are currently tied up in the trust." I remained completely silent, letting her words hang in the empty space between us. I wanted her to hear her own ridiculousness. "Anyway," she continued, her tone shifting into a bizarre, manipulative sweetness. "The annual property taxes for the house are due next week. It is a rather large sum. Since you are single, have a very good salary, and no longer have wedding expenses to worry about, we need you to transfer $15,000 to the LLC account to cover it. Family helps family. Nora, your sister needs a stable roof over her head right now." I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that startled even me. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of the request was almost artistic. She had evicted me from my own home, given it to my cheating fiancé and my pregnant sister, and was now demanding I pay the property taxes to keep a roof over their heads. They truly believed I was a mindless financial resource, an ATM that dispensed cash whenever they pressed the guilt button. "You evicted me, Vivian?" I stated calmly, my voice steady and cold. "I do not live there. I do not own the LLC. I am not paying a single dime for a property you stole. Do not ever call this number for money again." "Nora, you listen to me," she started to yell, her voice rising in pitch. I disconnected the call. I saved the audio file directly to my encrypted hard drive, filing it alongside Jasmine's boastful videos. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. I thought that was the absolute ceiling of their delusion. I thought they could not possibly demand anything more from me. Then, my phone buzzed with a text from Julian. If Vivian's phone call was a masterpiece of entitlement, Julian's text message was an absolute symphony of cowardice and greed. I picked up my phone and stared at the glowing screen. The message was 3 paragraphs long, filled with terrible grammar and pathetic justifications. He wrote that he was stressed about the impending baby and the rising costs of the unpermitted renovations. Then, he delivered the final fatal blow to whatever microscopic shred of respect I might have still held for him. Julian demanded that I contact the caterers, the lakeside venue, and the florist to demand a full refund for the $45,000 wedding deposit. He explicitly stated that since we were no longer getting married, it was only fair that I transfer that exact amount of cash directly into his personal checking account so he could buy designer nursery furniture and a new stroller for Jasmine. He actually believed that the money I bled for, the money I saved by skipping lunches and working until midnight, somehow, legally and morally, belonged to him and his new family. He thought he was entitled to a massive severance package for betraying me. If you've ever had a toxic person demand exactly what they stole from you, let me know in the comments. I did not feel angry. Anger implies a lack of control, a sudden rush of heated emotion. What I felt was absolute, profound clarity. Every lingering doubt, every tiny whisper of guilt that Arthur and Vivian had conditioned into my psyche over 30 years instantly evaporated. They were not my family. They were parasites actively trying to drain my life force to sustain their own. I took a screenshot of Julian's message and forwarded it to the secure file. I did not reply to him. I simply left a read receipt on the message, letting him know I had seen his pathetic demand and chosen absolute silence. I stood up from my desk. I smoothed down the lines of my tailored blazer. I checked my reflection in the dark window of my office. I looked like a woman entirely in control of her own architecture. I picked up the heavy red folder that my grandmother Eleanor had given me so many years ago. I walked out of my apartment, took the elevator down to the street level, and hailed a cab. The coastal air was crisp and clear, washing away the humidity of the previous weeks. I watched the historic buildings of Charleston roll past the window, admiring their solid brick foundations. A building is only as strong as the earth it sits upon. My family had stolen the bricks, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the ground rules of the game. The cab pulled up in front of the prestigious law firm. I paid the driver, tipped him well, and stepped out onto the cobblestone street. I adjusted my briefcase on my shoulder, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the red folder inside. I walked into the law firm. Walter was waiting for me in his corner office, 2 cups of black coffee already resting on his mahogany desk. He looked at the expression on my face and simply nodded, gesturing for me to sit. He did not ask for pleasantries. He knew exactly why I was there. I opened my briefcase, pulled out Eleanor's heavy red folder, and placed it squarely between us. They asked me to pay the property taxes on the house they kicked me out of, I said, my voice perfectly level. And Julian wants the $45,000 wedding deposit refunded directly into his personal account so he can buy baby furniture for Jasmine. Walter let out a low, dry chuckle, shaking his head. The sheer arrogance of the uninformed is always a spectacular thing to witness. Are you ready, Nora? Because once we open this door, there is absolutely no closing it. The fallout will be total. I have already attended the funeral for my expectations of them. Walter, I replied smoothly. Let us look at the foundation. Walter opened the red folder. He carefully spread the thick legal documents across the polished wood. There were original land surveys from the 1970s, intricate property deeds, and a very specific certificate bearing the seal of the state. When Arthur and Vivian forced you to put the structure of the antebellum house into their family LLC to secure the loan, they thought they had trapped you. Walter began. his finger tracing the lines of a complex legal text. They assumed the house and the land were a single, indivisible entity. Most amateur real estate investors make that exact mistake. But your grandmother Eleanor was not an amateur. Walter slid a document titled Irrevocable Trust toward me. 5 years ago, before the ink was even dry on your parents' LLC paperwork, Eleanor approached the original seller of the estate. She used a concept in property law known as a severed estate. It means the ownership of the physical structures on the surface can be entirely separated from the ownership of the land itself. I stared at the paperwork, the pieces of Eleanor's brilliant silent strategy finally clicking into place. Eleanor purchased the land, every single grain of dirt, every mineral, right beneath that house with her own private capital. Walter continued, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. She placed it into this irrevocable trust, naming you as the sole absolute beneficiary. The LLC, owned by Arthur and Vivian, holds the deed to the bricks, the wood and the roof, but they do not own a single inch of the earth it sits on. I looked up at Walter, the reality of my grandmother's ultimate protective measure washing over me. So, the house. The house is trespassing, Walter finished smoothly, because there is no commercial land lease in place between Arthur's LLC and your trust. Their building is illegally occupying your private property. I looked down at the signature of the woman who had truly loved me. Their stolen house was floating illegally on my dirt. The concept of property ownership is often misunderstood by those who rely on arrogance rather than education. In the office of my attorney, Walter, I received a masterclass in the quiet, absolute power of legal documentation. My family had triumphantly stolen the historic antebellum home I had poured my heart and savings into renovating. But they had no idea my grandmother Eleanor had left me a perfect shield through a legal mechanism known as a severed estate. While my parents' LLC owned the physical structure of the house, my irrevocable trust owned every single inch of the dirt beneath it, because they did not possess a commercial land lease. They were legally nothing more than trespassers. Alongside Walter, I turned my grandmother's brilliant foresight into a series of devastating legal consequences, a $60,000 retroactive commercial rent invoice and a formal 30-day eviction notice, demanding they physically remove their massive brick structure from my private land. Furthermore, the sheer arrogance of my sister, Jasmine, ignited a financial time bomb. She had proudly live-streamed herself hiring an unlicensed crew to demolish a 19th century load-bearing wall to build a nursery, completely bypassing city permits. We immediately forwarded the undeniable proof to the Heritage Conservation Board. The fateful confrontation took place in the soundproof glass conference room of my architectural firm, a space where the truth could not be hidden. My parents, Jasmine, and my cheating ex-fiancé, Julian, walked in with smug anticipation, assuming I had called the meeting to formally surrender my remaining rights. However, the moment I slid a black presentation folder across the table, their illusion shattered. My father turned a sickly grey, reading the land deed. Julian began sweating profusely at the sight of the massive rent invoice, and Jasmine shrieked hysterically as her luxury influencer lifestyle evaporated before her eyes. The final, lethal blow was a $150,000 municipal fine levied directly against their family LLC for the intentional destruction of a registered historical landmark. Their own greed had built a trap they could not escape. They were stuck with a house they could not sell, could not borrow against, and could not afford to keep on land they did not own. Julian, the coward who had violently betrayed me to latch onto Jasmine's promised free real estate, pathetically begged for mercy. I looked at him with absolute icy detachment, stated that I do not collect broken bricks, and calmly walked out with my golden retriever, Buster, leaving them to suffocate in the rubble of their own making. Their subsequent attempt at a legal counterattack instantly collapsed when their cheap lawyer realised Julian had previously signed away all equitable interest on a contractor liability waiver. The bank rapidly initiated a merciless foreclosure on the LLC. My parents lost their retirement savings and their polished social standing. Julian packed his cheap suits and fled the state in the middle of the night, abandoning a heavily pregnant Jasmine to face massive debt and crushing poverty entirely alone. Eventually, I repurchased the foreclosed structure from the bank for pennies on the dollar, legally reuniting the historic house with its land. I transformed the property into the Eleanor Heritage Foundation, a non-profit organisation dedicated to historic preservation and providing full-ride scholarships for underprivileged women entering architecture. Standing in the beautifully restored grand parlour a year later, alongside a respected colleague who treated me as an equal and my dogs safely resting by the fire, I did not feel euphoric joy over my family's ruin, but rather a profound, quiet peace. I mourned the family I never truly had, realising they had only ever viewed me as a utility. However, cutting those rusted emotional chains finally set me free. I learned that the most devastating and perfect revenge is not a screaming confrontation, but absolute unbothered silence. By refusing to engage or fund their toxic dynamic, I starved their fragile egos and allowed their own breathtaking greed to efficiently orchestrate their total downfall. The loudest revenge is not a shout, it is the sound of your own life, continuing beautifully and brilliantly without them. I no longer fight for a seat at a table designed to exclude me. Instead, I used my energy to build an impenetrable fortress on my own land, proving that the future belongs entirely to those who have the courage to walk away from betrayal and construct a magnificent new life.